This is our 75th lesson, and I don't plan to have any more lessons on this material. We'll stop at this point. That's 75 is enough lessons. And we'll be looking at the model and the scientific method linked with it. Now, on one of the points I made last week, I had some little bit of wording that was unclear and maybe even wrong. I've corrected in the book. My problem was I was working real hard to try to get the material finished for the class, and I was just running all day long with it and had some other problems that I was trying to deal with. And so I had some wording just a little bit awkward. I've corrected some of that, but the material in the book has been fleshed out a little more. I'm going to add another appendix to the book. I'm going to have it on logical fallacies and a lot of the atheist reasoning. And I'll give examples of them and quote them and cite them and show how they've argued fallaciously. And sometimes they've even violated the scientific method. So what we've seen is, and what we've been doing is trying to test my model and compare it with the atheist, agnostic, old earth creationist geologic model. And I've abbreviated FFM as Fox flood model. And I believe that my model explains what we've seen in changes of climate since the flood much better than the atheistic, agnostic, old earth creationist model. So that being the case, we won't go back and show all the reasons why, but we've developed this in the book. The first premise is if the Fox flood model is sound, then it will have a sufficient explanation for the climate changes since the flood. We've been seeing climate changes since that time. We've laid them out and shown the reasons for them, explaining them. The Fox flood model is sound, that's my claim. I've affirmed the antecedent, which is correct logic. Logic is sound, or at least it is valid, it's properly constructed. And it has a sufficient explanation for climate changes since the flood. Now, why am I making this argument? Because this is the argument that we'd have to test and to falsify my premise. My premise is my hypothesis. So if the flood model is sound, that's my premise. My hypothesis is my model is sound. Then we test it, and in the scientific method, you try to disprove the hypothesis. And you go through and set it up and test it and see if you disprove it. If you keep not being able to disprove it, the credibility of your hypothesis is enhanced. But remember, in scientific information, we never prove anything absolutely. And we've already been through that. We did discuss that in the last 2 weeks. So this is in our chapter here. So keep that in mind. I'm not claiming that this proves absolutely. I'm just saying it enhances the credibility of my model. I'm doing it from a scientific standpoint. It enhances its credibility. Every time it explains something correctly and never shows to be contradictory to what we see, then the model is more enhanced. We keep enhancing its value and its credibility. That's what we're doing here. It's possible that the agnostic, atheist, agnostic, old earth creationist geologic model is able to give an adequate explanation for climate changes. Now, I believe they can give some fairly reasonable explanation for climate changes, and but they do have a problem explaining the ice sheets and how they were formed. Now, we went through this and laid it out why they have a problem. Because when the air gets cold, the colder it is, it holds less and less moisture. And there's 3 things that enable air to have moisture in them. The temperature, the warmer it is, the more water it can hold. And the barometric pressure being higher barometric pressure can hold more water. And of course, then we have the temperature, barometric pressure, and what kind of material we have in the air, and that would be water vapor I'm talking about. And so what we have then is the various gases you have in it. So we have this point at which the water will come out. If you get it colder and colder, it can hold less and less water. In the wintertime, the air has a lower humidity than it does in the summer, generally speaking, all else being equal. So as the air gets colder, it can't have as much moisture. It has to have moisture to rain or snow or sleet. If it has no moisture in the air, there's nothing there to rain or cause snow or sleet. The driest place in the whole world is Antarctica, because the air is so cold, it doesn't have much precipitation. Any precipitation that it does have is along the edges of the continent. As it starts inland, it loses all of its moisture before it gets very far inland because of the cold air. And so it cannot, the glacier cannot be created by this means. And so that's a problem. That's definitely a problem. And I cited some sources that claim that this is a big problem that they've never answered. The Fox flood model explains the presence of both marine and terrestrial fossils in succeeding layers or strata. And we remember the cratons, that's like the tooth, root of a tooth on your tooth. And it sets down in the craton like a root on a tooth, sets down into the magma, and it floats. So the continents are floating on molten rock. And they're claimed to be stable. The cratons are claimed to be stable by geologists. That's their claim. They claim they're stable. Now, here's the problem. In order to get marine fossils, you have to lower the continent below the oceans to let the marine fossils be deposited. And then to get terrestrial or land fossils, you have to raise it back up above the ocean. So you got to raise and lower the ocean to get all these layers of terrestrial and marine fossils. And you got to raise these continents up and down, and there's no mechanism to do it. There's no evidence that it's ever done. And to get it lower, you have to put heavy rocks on the bottom of it. And then to raise it, you have to put light rocks on the bottom of it, or light material. So your material then determines the weight of that material, the density of it determines it. And so that's what has to be done. And that causes a real problem. Now, our first premise is the Fox flood model is sound. If it is, then it explains the presence of marine and terrestrial fossils in succeeding layers. Yes, my model does, because it's a tidal flood model. And the flood caused by strictly 40 days of rain doesn't explain it. My model is sound, and therefore it explains these things. So the fact that it can explain them and explains them quite easily, quite well, gets us by and gives more credibility to my model. Let us examine the atheist agnostic old earth creationist geologic model. If their model is sound, then it explains the presence of both marine and terrestrial fossils in succeeding layers or strata. It explains it. Well, it doesn't explain the presence of both marine and terrestrial fossils. They don't have a mechanism to raise the continents up and down to put the marine fossils on it and then go back up again and put terrestrial fossils, lower it again to put marine fossils. They don't have a mechanism to do that. It just doesn't happen in their system. So their system is not sound. It doesn't explain it. Now, are we claiming that this necessarily does away with all of their systems? Not necessarily, because they might come up with another system to explain it that would take care of these problems. But they haven't yet come up with one. That's their problem. So my model, Fox flood model, is much more reasonable. The only problem is it's theistic, and some of these atheists don't want to accept it. Since cratons are thought to be stable, there's no mechanism to lower and elevate the continents to explain the presence of both marine and terrestrial fossils in succeeding layers or strata for the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model. The Fox flood model explains the presence of impact craters and rings around the Earth that are filled with sediment. If the Fox flood model is sound, then it has a rational explanation for impact craters and rings around the Earth that are filled with sediment. So we have rings, craters and rings that lined up in a row like a machine gun went and just laid out. And these craters are lined up and they're filled up with sediment. Now my model explains it. I don't think that all flood models explain it, but mine does. The Fox flood model, I believe, is sound because of this. I'm claiming it is, and it explains it. It gives a rational explanation for impact craters and rings around the Earth. Now, the question is, let's examine the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model. If it's sound, then it has a rational explanation for these impact craters and rings around the Earth that are filled with sediment. And the problem is it doesn't have a rational explanation for impact craters and rings around the Earth that are filled with sediment. Therefore, their model is not sound. It fails again to explain. So the model needs to be readjusted and they need to, with a new model, but they haven't come up with one. My model, Fox flood model, is more rational than the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model, therefore. My model explains how minerals, that is copper, gold, silver, tin, and so forth, are in layers or veins in various parts of the Earth. It explains it. So if my model is sound, then it's going to give an explanation for these layers or veins. The rotating motion of floodwaters in the tidal action will do that. They'll sort them out like a centrifuge. So my model is sound. It explains them quite well. The agnostic, atheist, old Earth creationist geologic model. We examine their model. And what we have, if it's sound, various layers could not be found, would not be found in layers. So the minerals would not be found in layers if their model is sound, because it's a quiescent system. It's not a rotating motion of waters. The only waters are running in rivers and streams. Various minerals are found in layers and sediment. Their model doesn't predict that they should be. So it's not a sound model. Uniformitarian conditions do not normally sort minerals into veins. They don't normally do that. My model explains why dinosaur DNA has been found intact. If the Fox flood model is sound, then dinosaur DNA could be found intact. It's possible because it's not millions of years old, it's just a few thousand. The Fox flood model I claim is sound, and it does. Dinosaur DNA could be found intact according to my model. Let's examine the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model. And if that model is sound, then dinosaur DNA should not be found intact. It should not survive for millions of years without decay. But dinosaur DNA has been found intact, for their model is not sound. Dinosaur DNA should not be intact after millions of years. Now, this is evident from the responses of various scientists when it was first claimed that dinosaur DNA had been found. If you're reading in the journals, you saw that. The journals that were being published when they first came out with dinosaur DNA claims, because they were saying, well, that just can't happen. And there were a lot of writers claimed that. The Fox flood model explains the presence of ice in the craters at the poles of both Mercury and the Moon. Particularly with Mercury, it becomes a problem for the atheistic model. If the Fox flood model is sound, then ice could be in the craters at the poles of both Mercury and the Moon, because that ice was deposited there during the time of the flood, the 150 days that it was interacting with the Earth. My model, I believe, is sound. And so ice in the craters at the poles, the north and south pole of both Mercury and the Moon, was there at that time. So let's examine the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist geological model to see how it fits. If this model is sound, then ice could not be in the craters at the poles of both Mercury and the Moon. Now, it might have been on the Moon, but not on Mercury. Here's the problem. And we'll show the problem with the Moon as well. Ice in the craters, there is ice in the craters of both Mercury and the Moon. They found it there, and so it's in both of them. They were greatly surprised to find ice in the craters of Mercury, in the polar regions of Mercury. But my conclusion is the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist geological model is not sound. Now, why? Why would it not be found on Mercury? Well, ice should not be in the poles of Mercury for at least two reasons. Ice coming from comets could have such a velocity that will be vaporized upon impact just due to the energy released by the kinetic energy, the sudden stopping of it. The heat would have vaporized it. And I have sources in the book that claim that would have happened. It's coming toward the sun. When it hit the pole of Mercury, it would definitely have a problem. Now, here's the problem, another problem you get into, and this would be a problem with both the Moon and Mercury. To hit the pole, it has to come in at a pretty good angle because the sun is so much more powerful in its gravity than Mercury. And it's going to be dominating the trajectory of the comet, for example, if it's a comet. And it would not come in normally at the pole, the north or south pole, which are almost like 90-degree angles. They're perpendicular to the axis, is basically perpendicular to the sun. So another thing about ice, if Mercury is billions of years old, the ice just couldn't exist for that long, that close to the sun, even in shaded craters, just couldn't be there. And they were confused. They didn't predict it would be there. But my model predicted that it should be there some 20 some odd years ago. Again, the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist model has been shown to be irrational. It won't explain these things, but my model does. My model provides a mechanism for preservation of fossils. Hapgood tells us fossils, even under the most favorable conditions, fossilization is a rare accident. Page 69, Smith also, and pages 363 and 365. Now, these sources are quoted earlier in the book, so you have to hunt around for them in the footnotes. Okay? And you can go to the bibliography at the end of each chapter and find it. If the Fox flood model is sound, provides an excellent explanation for the preservation of fossils. And it is sound, so it provides an excellent explanation. Again, we haven't falsified my hypothesis. That's what we're trying to do, is falsify it to show it's not correct. Failure to falsify just enhances its credibility. We're going to examine the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist geological model. If it's true, if it's sound, then it provides an excellent explanation for preservation of fossils. Does not provide, we've denied the consequent, which is correct logic. That's what you should do to test your hypothesis. If you deny the consequence successfully, the hypothesis has to be discarded. You have to need to frame a new hypothesis. And so they don't provide an excellent explanation for the preservation of fossils. They need to either find a new way to preserve them with their model or come up with a new model. And so I believe their system is not sound. Now, why can't you preserve fossils? Why won't they be preserved? Because under uniformitarian conditions, now remember, the atheist basically denies uniformitarianism, but he always goes back to it for his explanations. But they claim that you have a catastrophe every now and then to occur. But under basically uniformitarian conditions, what happens is organisms that die will be fed on by other organisms. There are bacteria that'll break stuff down quickly. The top feeding organism in the whole Earth is bacteria. They'll eat you alive eventually, just chew you up and eat you. But what we have is there's all kinds of other animals, organisms that feed on dead and decaying organisms. And unless those organisms are covered quickly and covered deeply, they will be consumed and eaten by other organisms. Organisms that are in the sediment several feet down, they're benthic organisms that burrow into the sediment and eat the organism. They eat the organic matter, whether it be plant organic matter or animal organic matter. They'll eat it. They consume it. They're called benthic, B-E-N-T-H-I-C organisms. The Fox flood model explains why tectonic plates move in different directions. I'm going to try to make a chart for this, but if you look at it and think of this, you have two circles, one bigger than the other one being the Earth and the other being Mercury. What happens is that the gravity of Mercury pulls on different parts of the Earth at different angles. And so the plates, if they break up, and we do have plates, probably are, these plates will be pulled in different directions by the gravity. And so the plates move, they do move in different directions, but there's no reason for that. And that makes them move together and create fault lines and other problems. There's no basic reason for that unless we have my model. My model explains why that occurs, but the atheist model, agnostic model, old Earth creationist model does not explain it. So my model explains tectonic plates, why they move in different directions. Again, let's examine the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist model. If it's sound, it should be able to explain them as well, but it does not explain them. There's no explanation given for why they move in different directions. They can't give an explanation. So their model is not sound. It is more reasonable than their model. Now, why does the core of the Earth rotate faster than the rest of the Earth, and why does it appear to move at a different angle? Why does it rotate at different speeds? The core and the mantle. The core is basically solid, and the mantle is somewhat liquid. Think of it as a liquid. The spinning rotation of the core, the angular momentum is called, of the core, when the Earth, when it interacted with Mercury, it continued to spin, and the outer part of it slipped on the core, and it probably tilted it on its axis a little bit. It probably moved it upward, because my model has it coming in above the ecliptic plane. So it would pull it and rotate the outer portion of the Earth in a different rotation. It would not rotate at the same angle. So they'll be rotating at different angles. The center axis would be different. I'm trying to think of the term that would be used. What we get is the core would rotate, and then the outer portion would rotate in a different, it would move a few degrees, tilt a few degrees. That would make if the magnetic field is related to the core, That's why it would rotate and move around, because about every 300 years, the core will gain one turn on the rest of the Earth on its rotation. We've already seen evidence of that. They can't explain that, but my model does. It's perfectly good physics to explain it. So it explains why that happens. Now, you could take a tire, an automobile tire, if you don't have it tight and you just put it loosely on the rim, you can spin the tire and the rim not be spinning. Of course, if you tighten it up and put air in it, a tubeless tire, it'll spin the same speed. But that's basically what you're seeing here, very similar operation. We want to examine the atheist, agnostic, the old Earth creationist model. If it's sound, it explains why the core rotates faster. Well, it doesn't explain it, therefore it's not sound. There's something wrong with the model. It doesn't explain it. Now, why the magnetic field in the Earth wanders. Now, if it's located with the core and the core is not lined up at the same axis as the rest of the Earth, because the rest of the Earth got pulled more than the core did by Mercury, then they wouldn't be lined up, and the poles would wander and move around, and that will fit the model. So our model explains it. Why the Earth's magnetic field wanders and moves about. It's not aligned with the geographic poles either, see? And it explains why. And so my model is a good model. It explains it, and it's not been falsified. It explains why the magnetic field of the Earth wanders, moves about, and why it is not aligned with the geographic poles. But again, your agnostic, atheist, old Earth creationist, geological model does not explain it. Explain it, so it's not sound. That doesn't mean all their models are unsound. It just means this one's not, because it doesn't explain some phenomena. And they need to tweak it or come up with some way with this model to explain this phenomena. They may be able to do that. I wouldn't rule that out, but I'm just saying they haven't done it so far. And there's some pretty good minds working on it. The Fox flood model explains why the ocean floors do not have large amounts of sediment on them. Hapgood, page 25, talks about it. Dodd and Prothero do too. Both were surprised when they drilled into the ocean floors and found out they didn't have a lot of sediment. If my flood model is sound, then it explains why the ocean floors do not have large amounts of sediment, because the rotating flood material would have kept it basically on the land and not taken it into the ocean floors. The flood model is sound and it explains it. Again, the advocates of the agnostic, atheist, old Earth creationist model they actually expected to have deep layers of sediment in the ocean floors. When they actually drilled into them and they found they were surprised that it exists. And I've cited sources where they said they were surprised. In order to respond to this problem, they hypothesized, however, that the sediment was recycled by subduction and at boundaries. And this hypothesis, however, of subduction created another problem for the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationists. And the problem is the amounts of sediment implied that subduction recycled the sediment at short enough time spans that they should not be in the old sedimentary rocks. Therefore, they shouldn't be in the old fossils. Okay, so they have it subducting very rapidly. They should have been recycled about 25 times, according to one source that I cited. So all of the Earth's sedimentary rock should have been recycled 25 times in the so-called 4.5 billion years of the Earth's life. Okay. And again, let's examine the the agnostic, atheist, the old Earth creationist model. And if it's sound, it would explain why they don't have large amounts of sediment. And of course, their explanation is subduction, but it doesn't explain it adequately because it gets into another problem with subduction. It creates that model, that explanation actually goes counter to some other situations we see. They claim that the Earth is billions of years old, and that the fossils that some of them see that they are up in the order of billions of years old, but they should have been subducted and melted and recycled, but they're not, according to their view. So they get into a contradiction. Here's a prediction I'm making that has not been tested. My model would likely have debris from the crust of Mercury in some of the craters on the Earth. I believe that there's a strong likelihood that the rings of Mercury bombarded because of the gravity, the greater gravity of the Earth, would have bombarded Mercury and hit Mercury and removed most of its crust. And in fact, Mercury doesn't have much of its crust left. Most of its crust is gone, which is what I would predict would have happened. But my model would have this crust to be in some of the craters on the Earth. If they would drill into the craters and get the material that's there and the amount of various minerals that are in that crust, elements, and look at the number of elements that are in the crust of Mercury, they probably would be very, very similar. Now, they found meteorites from they say that's from the moon that are in some of the ice in the Antarctica and Greenland, and so we've already documented that as well. But if my model is sound, it's likely that there will be debris from the crust of Mercury in some craters. And I'll claim it's sound, and it's likely. This is a prediction I'm making. That's a strong likelihood that there would be some in those craters. And there probably might even be debris from the moon in some of those craters as well, because this material could have impacted the moon as well and caused pieces of the moon to be broken off and they ejected and come to the Earth. This hypothesis could be tested as well. It could be tested, and that would give great credibility to our hypothesis. Now, the agnostic, atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist model, if it's sound, then there shouldn't be debris from the crust of Mercury in some of the craters. There might be debris from the moon, but not from Mercury. That's why I zeroed in on Mercury. There's debris, there is, and that should be there is debris. And so there is debris from the crust of Mercury in some craters on the Earth. Now, that's my claim, there probably will be. And if that is proven to be true, that same premise is found to be true, then the agnostic, the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist Johnson model is not sound. We've tested mine against theirs. Now, this is one test that I'm forth here. It's an excellent test of my hypothesis versus their hypothesis. And I'm claiming, furthermore, that my model would have an optimum amount of oxygen, O2, about 35%, and an optimum barometric pressure between 2.5 to 3 times our present barometric pressure. 1 bar is our standard barometric pressure, and so it'll be about 2.5 or 3 bars. And in the antediluvian atmosphere, that would have what we would have had. And this hypothesis could be tested with hyperbaric chambers. And so I'm claiming that this amount, if my model is sound, then there would be an optimum amount of oxygen, about in the neighborhood of 35%, and an optimum barometric pressure between 2.5 and 3 times the present atmospheric pressure in the antediluvian atmosphere. That would be optimum for living conditions for humans and most animals as well. My model, I believe, is sound. Therefore, I'm claiming that this should happen, this should occur. And again, this is another hypothesis that could be tested and to see if it fits, my hypothesis fits. We would need to falsify the first premise by denying the consequent in order to disprove this hypothesis. I'm claiming that there's a likelihood that this would be the case. I'm not claiming certainty of it, though. And the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist geologic model does not hypothesize either an optimum barometric pressure or an optimum oxygen content for the atmosphere. Now, their problem is they claim organic macroevolution has occurred, and they should have had the animals and the plants evolving to the present conditions rather than to some optimum condition. And so they should have evolved to some present conditions. And so if both or either an optimum barometric pressure is or an optimum oxygen content for the atmosphere exists, and the Fox Club model is more rational than the old atheist agnostic old Earth creationist. My model explains the presence of undersea archaeological sites as well. We've studied those. The dating of the lowering of the sea levels from the ice ages of the atheist model has some problems with the presence of these archaeological sites. Therefore, my model is more reasonable than the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist geologic model. My model explains the presence of large mammoths in the Arctic regions. Now, the atheist agnostic old Earth creationist geologic model does not explain how large numbers of these mammals survived on tundra vegetation. We've looked at tundra vegetation. It's very fragile. You step on it, and it may take it 2 or 3 years to revive itself. It doesn't go through all of the stages every year. It just goes through one stage. It may set the blooms 1 year, put the seed the next, and then it goes through maybe, I think, 2 or 3 or 4 years to actually cycle itself. And so it's very, very slow about doing this. And yet we're led to believe that large elephants, which need about 500 or 600 pounds of forage every day, thousands, hundreds of thousands of them were existing at that time in this tundra vegetation. That's ludicrous, very ludicrous. If present attempts to resurrect mammoths are successful, and they are trying to do it, I don't know whether they're going to do it with their DNA cloning, but I think what they're going to do is they're going to try to get semen from a frozen mammoth and use that or somehow do that. But they supposedly are working on it, and they think they'll have it done in the next 3 or 4 years. Mammoths, if that present attempts are successful, we'll have a good test for my model hypothesis. I'm claiming that elephants probably cannot survive in extremely cold climates. Now, I know Asian and African elephants cannot. Now, if the mammoth is a different variety of elephant, it's possible it could, but there's not enough forage there for them to survive in what we know as the tundra today. Cannot happen. And so they couldn't survive because of food sources. And their big old feet would just crush the tundra vegetation. It'd take years for it to regrow. Just not going to happen. Didn't happen. And my claim is if they get these mammoths, it will cause a great crisis among them. If it doesn't survive, it can't survive cold climates. And I predict it won't, because it's an elephant. Just a variety of elephant probably can't survive it. It's evident that neither African and Asian elephants can survive cold climates. It remains to be seen whether or not mammoths can survive in cold climates, however, in the tundra. That my model explains the logarithmic decrease in longevity of post-flood men. We see this in Appendix A. Of course, the atheist, agnostic, and old Earth creationists will say that the genealogies of the Bible are fictitious. And even some that claim to believe the Bible say they're fictitious. The high coefficient of correlation, however, that I found in my mathematical analysis of it, I took their ages and took the base E logarithmic form, the Aperian logarithm, which is what you'd expect, logarithmic decay, and I I took the logarithm of it and I made it should have plotted, if it were perfect, would have plotted a straight line. And it was over 90% probability with Septuagint genealogy. That over 90% probability that it plotted a straight line. That's pretty good. None of the hypotheses of the flock-flood model have been falsified by the empiric evidence. Several of the implication hypotheses of the agnostic, atheist, old earth creationist geological model have been falsified. This only means, now keep this in mind, that the atheist, agnostic, old earth creationist geological model that was tested is unsound. They might come up with another model, and they need to, or their system is not as rational as my flood model. It doesn't necessarily mean that other models are unsound. It just means the one we tested is unsound. However, the falsification of the atheist, agnostic, old earth creationist claim that the earth is billions of years old seems to be insurmountable obstacles, to have insurmountable obstacles for them. They have serious problems with that. They need to develop a new hypothesis that deals with the factors that have been falsified, including the problems with the age of the earth. Here's a prediction I'm going to make, and this will be my last end of my material. The atheist, agnostic, old earth creationists will probably continue to ignore the facts and will not deal with these problems. That's my prediction.